Hello, I'm Bob the Booker, and welcome back to my channel. This is part 2 of my April reading wrap up. Almost forgot what month that was then, and you know I split it in two because it was getting a bit long. But yeah, please do. I hope you enjoy listening to part 1, and here is part 2, where I talk a bit more about some of the other books that I have really enjoyed this month. Next up, I read a couple of collections of poetry, and so again, very short, which is probably also how I got the 21 or whatever books this month. But first was My Darling from the Lions by Rachel Long, which was really interesting. I had heard a few things about it, but essentially it's a collection of poems that really, you know, some of them are much longer pieces, some of them are quite short, and they really explore sort of a lot around identity. There's this, because I listened to it as an audiobook, and again there was this really interesting moment where at one point the narration switches to really kind of South London speak, and like I know that, like that, I mean I'm from South London, like I know that accent, I know that like slang, despite this accent you know, being a bit of a mask for that. But it was so interesting because that felt so much like home, and I was perhaps a little bit more drawn to that bit for that reason. But I still thought, you know, overall the collection was just so powerful and so well done, talking about kind of various bits of duality around identity, so around race, around gender, around sort of various other things. I just thought was really interesting. And I also sort of just afterwards listened to Poor by Caleb Femi, and I've been meaning to read this for the longest time. I say longest time, it's only been out about a year, but I just thought this was brilliant. So Caleb Femi talks a lot about race, about identity. Again, it has sort of a very London feel, which I really loved, and I just thought this was so well done. I adored this. It's so for me, I don't want to pit them against each other in that sense, but you know, Rachel Long's poems I really enjoyed and thought were really well crafted. But for me, Caleb Femi's was that, plus there was this kind of, I kind of was thinking about them a lot more afterwards, perhaps. And I just thought Poor is such a brilliant collection. It just, the voice of these novels is just so, I mean, long-term subscribers may know that I have a bit of a thing for very sort of strong, passionate voices in books. I love it when something feels so crystal clear and kind of punchy, and is not afraid to get kind of ugly in parts. And for me, that's what is so effective about this collection. I just thought Poor was so well done. It's just, at times it feels suffocating and brutal, and kind of, again, it feels very London. Like there are some moments where it feels like you're in a bit of a kind of concrete jungle. Like he captures that idea of sound and busyness and noise everywhere around you, which feels to me so sort of London or very big city, and I'm always quite drawn to that, and then especially when it's then balanced by something a bit sort of more open, you know, that kind of feels a bit less hurried and a bit less rushed, and I think this collection does that so beautifully. So yeah, I love this. I totally see why it was one of those things that was nominated for pretty much every poetry and any prize that basically takes poems. So I think it was in there because it's one of those. It reminded me a bit of Portable Paradise by Roger Robinson, which I read last year, which I just thought was, again, like that, they're both a really great combination of sort of London vernacular with these like really beautiful poetic descriptions at times. It's gorgeous. Yeah. Anyway, next was Number 9 Dream by David Mitchell. I realised I forgot to kind of talk a bit more about Cloud Atlas earlier, which is also by David Mitchell. So Cloud Atlas, 6 interwoven stories that kind of range sort of over hundreds of years. Didn't always fully enjoy it, but thought there was a lot, you know, some of the stories I found really, I just didn't get on with. Some of them I loved, and so it was a bit of a weird one for me overall. But with Number 9 Dream, again, maybe this is sort of just a thing I have with David Mitchell. Maybe I need to break it with, maybe, I've heard, I think, is it 1,000 years of Jacob de Zoet or something like that? those other books by him, I've heard of maybe kind of a bit more accessible. I think for me, Number Nine Dream, so it's this idea of this sort of young boy in Japan looking for his father. And at times it feels like it kind of goes into uh, like I feel like it has like really strong reference points, and I couldn't always necessarily cling to those that much. So occasionally it feels like it goes into like kind of cop drama, 80s robot ninja kind of style things of like, you know, um, like people stabbing each other in the back and all these sort of shady deals and all that kind of stuff. And I found that really entertaining, but at times it felt like for me that just threw off the tone of whatever else I was reading. So I couldn't ever really get into this. I never really felt sort of part of it. And I think I did find myself reading it quite quickly kind of towards the end and sort of just not necessarily in a good way, of kind of just like, you know, sort of not skimming, but kind of letting it wash over me a bit. So it didn't always work for me, but there were moments for me of brilliance where I just thought this was really entertaining, really funny, really powerful and tense and gripping, and other times where I was just like, oh, come on. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird one for me. And on a similar note, The War of the Poor by Eric Vuillard. So this was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize, much to many people's surprise. I listened to this before this shortlist, just kind of, because it was like an hour-long audiobook, and I'd seen Eric Carl Anderson's review at Lonesome Reader, where he had really not gotten on with it and had sort of described it as sort of feeling like an extended Wikipedia entry. And so I thought, this is only an hour long, let me just listen to this and see what I think. And I kind of agree. There were moments where I just thought this was really interesting, but it does feel at times, there's an interesting blurring between fiction and non-fiction, where for the most part, I mean, I absolutely see what Eric means, and I agree, it feels like a Wikipedia entry, because it's like, this person did this in this year, and it doesn't feel like the descriptions go any further beyond that. There's a little bit of kind of more of a story bit towards the end, but I'm still a little bit baffled by it being on the shortlist, partly because for me the judges seem to really love this. They called it something like a blazing fire of a book, and I can see the kind of passion aspect of it, because it does kind of concern this character who was sort of a bit of a radical and a bit of a rebel in various ways. And I can see how that's really punchy and really interesting, but for me it never kind of quite crossed the finish line. Partly it felt like it stopped quite early, and I almost, you know, that early sort of Wikipedia entry sort of style bit, if that had then been followed by a real story that kind of led you through it, I think I would have been a bit more on board. As it was, it kind of just stopped, and I was like, oh, okay. There we go. So I don't know, maybe. The next one, though, I did adore. I might do a separate video on this because I have so many feelings, but I also, it's just gorgeous in so many ways. Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters, which I just think is stunning. So it is about, it is written by a trans woman, and it's great to see a trans woman writing about trans characters getting so much love and attention. And it is about this sort of triangle kind of in the middle of these three characters. So one, Reese, is a trans woman who wants to be a mother. She used to date Reese, not Reese, I just said Reese, used to date Ames, who was previously known as Amy. So basically they transitioned and were known as Amy for several years, but then have detransitioned and are now known as Ames. And it's the reason I wouldn't normally like using both names in that sense, but the book uses both names quite commonly and quite often. So Reese almost always calls Ames Amy, but Ames is Ames to everybody else. And there is also Katrina, who is Ames's boss, who they have a bit of a sort of a fling at work, and a bit of a thing that kind of goes on, and Katrina gets pregnant, much to everybody's surprise, because Ames assumed that he was sterile from transitioning and then detransitioning. And so it's really interesting because this all happens, and then there's this kind of scenario where essentially it's, do we have these, you know, they kind of almost have this idea of bringing up the family as a bit of a trio, this very kind of queer family model. And I just thought this was so gorgeous and so effective in so many ways. It's funny. It is so funny. It's very dark at times, but always with a kind of an undertone of kind of love and warmth and humour. And so, for example, there's a moment where they're at a funeral, and obviously not normally grounds for comedy, but there are just so many things that happen in that moment that are just so well written and so well observed, I think. I say this as someone who is not trans, but, you know, I mean, for me, I saw something that was really interesting with someone reviewed it on Goodreads, and said, this is, I'm paraphrasing wildly here, but basically said that this book is very much not in front of the cis, as in conversations trans people would have with each other when non-trans people are not present. And that really struck a chord with me, because that's exactly how this feels. I mean, I, again, do not, I'm not trans, but I've sort of definitely found within, you know, for example, when I'm with other LGBTQ people, there is a kind of common knowingness and an understanding, and we talk perhaps differently to how we might talk in front of people we don't know that well, or people who perhaps don't identify within the community. And that suddenly, that for me suddenly struck a chord of, this is why this book feels so fresh, because this feels like the sort of raw conversations that, you know, these trans characters would have, but we're just being invited in to see them. And I just thought it was so brilliant and so effective at doing this, and I adored this book. I did not want this to end. I wanted this to be like twice the length. I want this to be a TV series. I love this. Yeah, this moment at a funeral, for example, they talk about trans characters, trans people, and their kind of relationship with essentially death and mourning, and how, you know, because of the high death rate for trans people, either through suicide or through violence, or through, you know, kind of health complications brought on by poverty or other things. This is sort of something they've had to grapple with a lot more in their lives, which is heartbreaking. But this is done so well, where there are these kind of older trans characters who are kind of over it almost, because they're like, oh, another funeral, great, you know. And this very kind of dark gallows humour from it. I just thought this was stunning. I mentioned it in my book of predictions, before I'd read it, that I thought it would have a good shot, and I really hope that this gets picked up by major prizes this year. I mean, it was longlisted for the Women's Prize. I'm kind of surprised it didn't make the shortlist, but, you know, glad it got the recognition of the longlist at least. I love this. I love this so much. This is a book that I want to buy multiple copies of and just give to people. It's great. It's so great. Okay, I'm going to stop rambling about it. It's good. That's my impression. Next up, you can see that I started getting back on my little booker train. So I started reading a few of the books from the 1971 shortlist, partly because I'm going back and doing all the ones and sixes. Well, basically I'm gonna do all the 70s and then do all the ones and sixes. Yeah, so I was having a little look at 1971. So this was, the first one I read from it was, well, second really, it was Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont by Elizabeth Taylor. And this name, I mean, is kind of brilliant in its own way, but I love that it kind of automatically, I thought I would dislike this book because of the title, because I imagined that it was this going to be very sort of pretentious kind of thing. I was very wrong. Elizabeth Taylor is brilliant. She is, for me, I mean, this is the only book of hers I've read so far, but for me, she just feels like an absolute queen of observations and very quick, witty put downs. So she will be, I took pictures of this all the way through, like, you know, just sort of like was taking pictures of pages as I was going, just to look back on them later. But she will have characters sort of say things, and then there'll be a very quiet observation in the background. So this book is all around the idea of these kind of characters who are old and retired, and they basically go to the Claremont Hotel to basically to live out their last years, as morbid as that sounds. So they kind of go to this nice fancy hotel and they live there, and as a result you've got this community of old people. So it basically is a retirement home, or a kind of an old person's home. But for me, this book is so successful because it is all the little observations of these kind of very ingrained habits and traits that these characters have had over many, many years, which are very, very funny and silly. Then, you know, some characters are really pretentious and really think they're all that. There's this one man who basically never listens to anyone. But there's a great moment with that, because all the way through the book, everyone is just like, oh, this man is such a bore. And then at one point, somebody sort of somebody agrees with him, and we get a little side note, kind of I can't remember his name now, sort of, you know, blah blah blah, thought he was very agreeable. And I just love the idea that this man who is quite cantankerous thinks everyone's pretty rubbish. As soon as someone vaguely agrees with him, he's like, he is a good man, he has good opinions. And I've definitely known characters like that, and I love it. I thought it was so funny, and I just raced through this. I just thought it was brilliant. This Mrs. Palfrey, sort of central character, she wants to be basically visited by her grandson, and he doesn't come. But she sort of strikes up this friendship with this younger man, who at first it seems the kind of younger man's sort of reasons for wanting to go are basically she will pay for food, and he is sort of a starving artist working on his novel, but also he wants to go there and observe these characters and write down things from them. So it's kind of a weird sort of transaction. But when she obviously introduces this young man, because of, you know, keeping up appearances, she cannot mention that this man is not her grandson. So she has to basically ring him up in advance and sort of say, look, your name is this. This is your backstory. You work at the British Museum. You know, because she has to keep up appearances, and it's so funny and so well done. And I just thought it was great. Yeah, really, really well done. Next up from that shortlist was the Goshawk Squadron. I can't read my own writing there, by Derek Robinson. So this is based around World War One, with sort of fighter pilots. Not always that successful for me. I mean, I sometimes find it. I'm not always that interested in stories about war, depending on how they're done. There are some that I've really enjoyed, but sometimes I feel like it's very much like war is used instead of developing other bits of the plot, if that makes sense. So kind of like, oh look, war is really difficult and bad, and I'm going to as a result, not kind of build a world, or I'm not going to do other things. I don't think he necessarily falls down on that, but for me, it was a lot about fighter pilots, and there were some really great moments in terms of parts of it are very funny, parts of it are really quite well done in terms of, you know, watching these characters take to the skies knowing that they're probably going to die, and, you know, even the most celebrated person, you know, from these one of the most celebrated pilots that they talk about, you know, I think they talk about him shooting down like 100 planes or something like that, and the characters around almost the kind of feeling quite disappointed, thinking actually the average soul, you know, if the best person only shoots down 100, that's not that many. You know, and it's a lot for one man, but actually there are thousands and thousands of planes coming, so we're as likely to be killed by this as we are to kill. So really interesting, looking at the futility of war kind of thing. I don't know how well this book works for me, or how well it's perhaps remained, or, you know, how it sort of stood up to the test of time for me, but I still thought it was interesting in its own way, and really interesting with going back to old Booker shortlists, particularly ones in the 70s. The themes feel so different to the ones we're looking at now. Like, there's a lot more in those ones about empire, about war, because that was a bit more current, right? You know, so it's really interesting to kind of see how those all go. Then the last two books I read this month. So the first was Second Place by Rachel Cusk, which I think is due to come out fairly soon, I think in early May. And I hadn't read anything by Rachel Cusk before, but I'd always seen her work kind of around, I think it's the Outline series, or I think Outline is a famous book of hers. But Second Place is all about, it's kind of this woman called, I think, L, and the man's called M, or the other way around. I'm entirely getting this wrong, but the sort of central woman behind the story is writing a letter to her partner. And there is this artist who has come to stay with her, and she's sort of part of a residential kind of, you know, artist in residence kind of thing. And we basically watch how that relationship gets really tangled and difficult, because we kind of go from what seems quite pleasant at first to essentially a bit of a breakdown, and he gets quite angry and aggressive and violent. There's this kind of, yeah, it's quite a short book as well, so I kind of raced through it and then got to the end and kind of wasn't fully sure what had just happened in some ways. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting. It's my first time reading Rachel Cusk, as I said, and I really want to check out more based on this, because I just thought some of her observations were so well done. and so interesting. But maybe this is the subject matter, in terms of subject matter, maybe this is not necessarily the book for me, but really enjoyed a lot of it, and thought the way she details this sort of through letters is really quite powerful, because as a result you kind of get the sense that there's something that she's hiding and something that she's not quite telling. Yeah, just really, really interesting. And finally, this month, the book that I kind of ended on, and I only really finished recently via an audiobook, The Sea by Iris Murdoch. Now, in the last month or so, I read, well, a couple of months ago, The Black Prince by Iris Murdoch, and adored it, and just thought, this woman is brilliant. How have I taken so long to really read her? I've listened to the audiobook of The Good Apprentice, and I can't remember fully. I thought a lot of it was really good. I just didn't fall in love with it that much. But for me, The Sea, I just thought is an absolute masterpiece. So it's all about this man, Charles Araby, who is basically a cad, a player, a bit of a terrible man in many, many ways, almost sociopathic in some of his ways. And essentially, he has sort of, over his life as an actor, and I listened to the audiobook being read by Richard E. Grant, which was kind of brilliant, because Richard E. Grant plays these kinds of characters, thinking of sort of Withnail and I, and sort of other things. So imagine that as in kind of a novel form. And Charles Araby is not a nice man. He is a bit of a womanizer, and he has basically all of these ex-lovers who both still like him, but also really resent him for the way he's treated them. And he's sort of, you get the idea that the feeling that he's always sort of hopped on from woman to woman, as soon as they can't meet one very small need of his. And he's sort of a snob as well about bits of food, and we get these lengthy descriptions of, the perfect sandwich or the perfect wine or whatever. And so we get this real picture of him as a man of kind of who sees himself as having very refined taste, but is perhaps doesn't really suffer fools gladly in some ways. And so he basically tries to concoct a plot to get back the one woman he has ever truly loved. And it's so interesting because he, like I said, is almost sociopathic in the way he does this. He is almost quite willing to destroy people in the way to making this happen. And this book is about 600 or so pages long. The first part of the novel ends at about 300 pages. And legitimately, if the book had stopped there, I would have given this 5 stars and been like, wow, that was incredible. And then the book somehow keeps elevating, and I just thought it was incredible. So there is then the whole thing with his ex-wife. Were they married? Or his former partner, the woman he's in love with. She has a new partner. And so he is partly trying to destroy this man as well. There is a son who is adopted, and there's this whole lengthy plot around how this son Titus, how the new man in this woman's life is convinced that actually it was Charles Araby's all along, and that this woman has sort of been caught in the middle and has sort of tried to pass it off as being adopted when it's really her son. With Charles Araby. And it's so well done, because like I said, if that book had ended there at 300 pages, I would have been like, this is great. Then it kept going, and about 450 pages, I think it must have been, I just thought, like, this is exceptional. And then it kept going, and I don't know how Iris Murdoch did this, but it just, for me, this book just kept on getting even stronger, because we start off, and where that book ends at, where that first part ends at 300 or so pages, we kind of have a natural summary in some ways, with some some lingering bits that are unsorted, but it kind of closes off some of those ideas around loss and around memory, and around this character's sort of quest to get back with her. And then what is just so brilliant for me is how it just keeps pushing further and further and further, because we then get to this stage where there is a death of a character that feels so shocking, because at this point you can't tell if this is part of a plan, if this is a purely accidental thing, and then it keeps going, and we get even more about other characters falling down and being their lives being destroyed. Charles Araby does not care in some ways about absolutely destroying the lives of women he used to be with, as long as he can get back to this one woman who he loved. And I think this is also so interesting, this being written by a woman in Iris Murdoch, just to kind of, because there is something, the female characters in this book are so well rendered and so interesting that despite the fact that we're seeing all of this through this man's eyes, we get a really strong sense of who these women are, and not only why they like Charles Araby in the first place, but now why they hate him. And it's so brilliant. I have to admit, I was really intimidated by the length of this and by many of Iris Murdoch's other books. I think many of her books are, you know, sort of in the sort of 300, 400 page range. A fair few as well are also sort of 500, 600 pages, including a lot of the ones that were shortlisted for the Booker, which I will have to read at some point. But I mean, if they're of this kind of quality, I do not mind. I was stunned by this book. I just think it's incredible. And yeah, I think I'm becoming a bit of an Iris Murdoch fan, quite possibly. Yeah, this book is incredible, and the ending for me is so powerful. I don't know how she keeps ramping it up further and further, how we take what is a really ordinary story and it gets even more twisted, and then there are twists on those twists, and then it's everything. As you may be able to tell, I liked it just a little bit. So anyway, those have been the books that I read during the month of April. I'd love to know your thoughts if you've read any of these, or if you've got any kind of similar recommendations based on those. I'm realising that I've read quite a lot of Booker Prize books recently and still have quite a lot more on hold from the library. So I think in May, where possible, I'm going to try and mix it up a little bit, because I'm starting to feel a little bit, not burnt out, but a little bit too much on the Booker train, and sometimes it's nice to have a break and remember, you know, that there are other books out there that I am actively choosing to read, not just being sort of, you know, funneled down this little line of things to read. But anyway, that aside, I hope you've had a great reading month, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I've been Bob Booker. Thank you for listening and watching and whatever else that we say on BookTube stuff. Thank you. Take care and enjoy your reading. Bye bye.